What if the man, mopping Harvard's halls at night, once held the answer to its greatest scientific failure, and no one ever knew? If you ever found yourself walking through Hamilton Physics Hall at Harvard around 2 in the morning, you might have noticed him. Not a professor. Not a student. Just a quiet, thin man in a grey maintenance uniform, pushing a worn-out cart down the dim corridors. He didn't speak. Most people didn't even see him. And if they did, they forgot just as quickly. On the staff roster, he was listed simply as Reed, C Maintenance, Night Shift. But some students, the ones who stayed late enough to notice, called him the ghost of Hamilton Hall. He walked the halls like he remembered them from another lifetime. And maybe, in a way, he did. That man Clarence Reed was about to change Harvard forever. The university had spent over 7 years and nearly $400 million on a groundbreaking initiative called HALOS, the Harvard Advanced Logic Optimization System. It was designed to transform quantum-based AI simulations and launch Harvard into an entirely new era of computational science. They built an entire lab for it, recruited top minds from around the world, and when it was finally completed, expectations were sky high. But on one cold Tuesday evening, everything fell apart. Without warning, HALOS shut down. No lights. No signals, no logs, nothing. The mainframe went dark like it had never existed at all. Panic swept across campus. Phone calls rang through the night. Professors were pulled out of bed. Graduate students rushed in, still wearing pajamas under their coats. The lab was sealed. Inside, dozens of minds tried to fix what had broken. They rebooted systems, ran diagnostics, pulled out code from every direction, but nothing responded. By 2:17 a.m., most of the staff had gone home in quiet defeat. Except one. His name was Elijah Dawsoner, third-year undergraduate. He didn't have clearance. Didn't have prestige, just a temporary ID badge and a fascination with systems no one else wanted to touch. Most days, he fetched coffee. He filled out data logs. But tonight, he stayed. He sat alone in the diagnostics room, staring at a screen that refused to wake up. And that's when he heard it. Not a voice, just footsteps. Slow, careful, like someone walking to avoid waking the building itself. Elijah turned. There, passing by the open doorway, was the janitor Clarence Reed. Same grey uniform. Same old cart, but something on that cart caught Elijah's eye. Not cleaning supplies. Not tools, a box more, like a machine. It was oddly shaped, covered in copper coils and wires, taped together with care and purpose. Scrawled across the top was a handwritten note, "Do not touch," calibrated to 0.00001 variance. Elijah froze. That wording it wasn't random. It was precise. He was studying quantum variance in one of his advanced courses, and that kind of calibration, that wasn't janitorial work. "Excuse me, sir," Elijah called out, hesitantly. The janitor didn't stop, didn't even turn. Elijah stood and stepped closer. "What is that?" he asked, pointing gently. Still nothing. But just before turning the corner, Clarence slowly turned his head. Not to glare, not to smile, just to look. It was a stare that felt older than the hallway itself. "I'm Elijah," the student said quietly. "I'm working on the HALOS team. It crashed tonight. Nobody knows why." At the word HALOS, something flickered in Clarence's hand, a small tremor. So small, it could have been imagined. But Elijah saw it. Curiosity burned inside him. He followed. Not to an office, not to a lab, to a forgotten room marked Staff Lounger. Space students never entered. Inside, the dust hung in the air like silence made visible. But in the corner sat something extraordinary, a hand-welded aluminum frame. Blueprints in blue ink pinned to the walls, equations written in fine cursive script, graceful and complex, and at the center, a device. Small, blinking, alive. It wasn't humming, it wasn't fluctuating, it pulsed, steady. Perfect. Elijah's breath caught. You built a thermal light frequency stabilizer, he whispered. Clarence didn't respond, but he didn't need to. It was real. And somehow, Elijah knew this wasn't the first time Clarence had touched genius, just the first time someone noticed. That night, everything changed. And yet, Harvard didn't know it yet. Not the professors still fighting dead servers, not the administrators scrambling for answers. Not the donors who believed their money had bought perfection. Only a janitor and a student stood in that dusty room, where the future had already been fixed, quietly, invisibly, by hands no one thought to ask. The next night, Clarence Reed was back. Same uniform, same cart, same quiet steps down the corridor. But Elijah Dawson couldn't sleep. After what he had seen, what he felt, his mind wouldn't stop racing. Every textbook, every theory, every lecture he had ever sat through felt suddenly incomplete. Because in that dim, forgotten lounge, he had seen something that shouldn't exist, something impossible, and yet working, the stabilizer. It wasn't a model, it wasn't digital, it was handcrafted, like an instrument built to play with the laws of entropy themselves. The next morning, while the Halos lab remained lifeless, Elijah skipped class and buried himself in the Harvard archives. He knew what he was looking for: a name. The man who built that device wasn't just a janitor. He was someone else, someone who had been someone. But names were hard to come by. Digital records had gaps. Old rosters were oddly scrubbed. It was as if someone had gone through and erased certain lines of history, just enough to make them forgettable. But then, in a physics paper dated 1983, buried deep in the system, Elijah found it. A page on adaptive variance theory, signed with nearly invisible initials. CR. Clarence Reed. His heart jumped. It had to be him. The theory described in the paper matched the principles Elijah had seen operating in the machine. And the signature, it wasn't just casual, it was calculated, as if the author had tried to erase himself, but not completely. By mid-afternoon, Halos still wouldn't boot. Professors were getting restless. Technicians were exhausted. And the dean, Dr. Howard Ellison, had started pacing through the lab like a man watching his career dissolve in real time. Elijah walked in unnoticed. His hands were shaking, clutching a cloth-wrapped object. Clarence's invention. He didn't ask permission. He didn't make a speech. He simply crossed the lab to a dusty, unused interface portone nobody had used in years and plugged the device in. A long, sharp beep filled the room. The lights flickered once, then again, and then. Halos breathed. Monitors lit up, code scrolled, power surged back into the system like life into a body that had been still too long. People gasped. No one knew what had just happened, but Halos was alive. And standing in the hallway, just outside the glass, pushing his cart as if nothing at all had changed, was Clarence Reed. He didn't stop, didn't turn. Just walked, like a ghost, leaving a room he once called home. Years earlier, in the spring of 1983, room 412 in Hamilton Physics Hall had been alive with energy. It was the center of an experimental research group under Professor Howard Ellison, and it was buzzing with quantum dreams. Among the team was a quiet, focused young man, Clarence. He didn't speak much in meetings. But when he did, the room listened. His equations were elegant. His logic was clean. He thought in curves, while others thought in corners. And he wasn't alone. Beside him was Naomi Wells, his research partner, and his heart. Naomi was brilliant in her own right. Where Clarence's thoughts curved inward, hers shined outward. She was radiant, fearless in debate, gentle in silence. If Clarence was the circuit, Naomi was the current. They were engaged to be married that June. But science, like life, doesn't always wait for celebrations. One late night, the team ran an experimental test on energy containment using an unstable resonance method. Clarence had gone home early, Naomi insisted. He looked tired. She wanted him to rest. She stayed to recalibrate the test system with 2 other researchers. What happened next was never publicly explained. An overload, an energy spike, a flash of electromagnetic force that scorched the lab. Naomi died instantly. 2 others were injured. Clarence arrived the next morning, too late to do anything but fall to his knees in front of what was left. The shock was unspeakable. The grief came fast, and so did the blame. Professor Ellison, under pressure, told the press there had been serious concerns regarding design errors, especially in the calibration protocols created by Mr. Reed. It wasn't true, but it was easy. Clarence didn't protest. He didn't argue, didn't sue, didn't cry out. He just disappeared. His name was quietly removed from shared research. His access credentials deleted. Papers co-authored with him vanished from the library catalog. By the end of the week, he no longer existed in Harvard's records. But Elijah had found the fingerprints. He had seen the math. He had seen the machine. And more than that, he had seen the man. Back in the archive room, Elijah held a scanned letter in trembling hands. Dated May 3rd, 1983. A note from Naomi. Clarence, I reviewed the resonance algorithm again. You're right. We shouldn't push the test tonight. I'll try to convince David. Love always N. David. That was Ellison's first name. The letter confirmed what Elijah already suspected. Clarence had warned them. Naomi had agreed, and they had been ignored, then buried. Now, decades later, a forgotten man had quietly brought Halos back to life. And no one had even seen it happen, except one student, one believer, one voice willing to ask, why did they erase him? And more importantly, what else did he build that no one ever asked about? That night, Elijah Dawson couldn't stop thinking about the stabilizer. Not the machine itself, but how it had been built, how something so refined, so delicate in its balance, could be crafted by a man who mopped floors for a living. It didn't make sense. But then again, that was the point. Clarence Reed wasn't who Harvard thought he was, and Elijah was no longer content being just a quiet observer. He needed answers. So just past midnight, Elijah waited in the hallway near the staff lounge. He knew Clarence would pass by eventually. And sure enough, at 12:41 a.m., The familiar creak of wheels echoed off the tile floors. Clarence came into view, his cart as worn as his shoes, moving with steady rhythm. "Mr. Reed," Elijah said, his voice low but sure. Clarence paused, not surprised, just still. "I read the letter," Elijah continued, "the one from Naomi. That name shifted something." Clarence turned his head just slightly. Not enough to show his full face, but enough for Elijah to feel the weight in his silence. "I know you warned them," Elijah said. "I know you tried." Clarence took a breath, barely audible, and resumed walking. But Elijah followed. "You loved her," Elijah said quietly. Clarence stopped again. This time, he spoke. "I never stopped," he said, voice sanded by age and regret. They stood in silence for a moment, the humming of the hallway lights their only witness. "I think the world deserves to know what really happened," Elijah offered. "They erased you, but they can't erase this," he said, pulling the schematic he had copied from the stabilizer. Clarence didn't look at it. Instead, he said something Elijah didn't expect. "They didn't erase me," Clarence said softly. "I let them." Elijah blinked. "I could have fought, gone to the press, filed appeals, but I didn't. I disappeared. I chose silence." "Why?" Elijah asked. Clarence looked at the boy. "You ever build something so fragile that even explaining it too loudly might break it?" Elijah didn't know how to answer that. "I built the stabilizer to protect Halos from itself, just like I built silence to protect what little memory I had of her." He started walking again, but Elijah wasn't finished. "Then why come back now?" he asked. "Why show me anything at all?" Clarence gave a small shrug. "Because you asked," he said. "No one's asked in a long time." The next day, Harvard buzzed with activity. No one knew exactly why Halos had rebooted, but the rumors were growing. Some said a grad student had hacked it. Others whispered of a mysterious patch left undocumented, but none of them guessed the truth. Howard Ellison, however, had his suspicions. He stared at the logs on his monitor. Stabilizer port, EXT17 input variance, 0.00111 status, stable WTK3X signature, confirmed. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. That signature, WTK. He hadn't seen it in decades. It had been Clarence's personal code short for Whittaker Thermal Key, a method he developed with Naomi in the early 80s. Ellison had buried that name deep, but he hadn't forgotten it, and now, somehow, it had returned. He slammed the monitor shut. This wasn't just a glitch. It was a resurrection. Meanwhile, Elijah found himself drawn back to the old lounge, to the little corner where Clarence kept his inventions hidden from the world. But this time, it looked different. Organized. Cared for, like a shrine. Blueprints hung neatly on the wall. Old components lay carefully arranged on felt pads, and in the center of the table sat a notebook, unlocked, open, waiting. Elijah hesitated, then sat down. He flipped the first page. Inside, he saw sketches, not just technical ones, but personal. A drawing of Naomi, her face calm. Notes written in her handwriting, half-finished thoughts shared between collaborators, between lovers. Equations with arrows, questions in the margins. Could energy be curved instead of stabilized? Try copper loop at 0.0001V and let the frequency breathe. Clarence says entropy doesn't need control, just rhythm. Each page felt like an echo from another life, and in that room, Elijah didn't feel like a student anymore. He felt like an inheritor of pain, of brilliance, of something sacred that had been left to die in silence. By the time evening fell, Elijah knew what he had to do. He printed the schematic. He copied Naomi's letter, and he wrote a note of his own. He slipped all 3 pages into an envelope and left it anonymously on the desk of Professor Howard Ellison. Inside, he wrote only one sentence. "She believed him, and so do I." Clarence Reed hadn't stepped inside Lab 7 in 40 years, not since the fire. Not since Naomi, but that morning he stood just outside its sealed door, watching the amber security light blink in silence. It was Elijah Dawson who had brought him there. Quietly, before sunrise. The hallway was empty, except for the 2 of them. Elijah stood a few steps behind, gripping a worn notebook under his arm. His heart pounded like it was his own trial, not Clarence's. "I can open it," Elijah said. "I still have shadow clearance from the Halos team." Clarence didn't respond, just kept his eyes on the door, his breathing steady but tight, like every molecule in his chest was trying to escape the weight of memory. "I don't have to, though," Elijah offered. "If it's too much." Clarence raised one hand gently, not to stop him, just to say, "It's all right." So Elijah typed in the code, the panel beeped, the lock clicked. The door opened, and just like that, Clarence Reed crossed back into the room that once defined his life and nearly ended it. The lab hadn't changed much. Newer screens, maybe, sleeker instruments, but the scent, still the same, burnt circuitry and stale ambition. He walked slowly across the floor, to the far left corner, to the place where Naomi had stood on the night she died. He didn't touch anything. He just closed his eyes. Elijah stayed near the entrance, unsure if he should speak, or breathe, or leave the man alone with his ghosts. "This was where she warned them," Clarence said softly. Elijah stepped forward, just a little. "I saw the note," he said. "She told them not to run the test." Clarence nodded. "She always saw farther than I did," he murmured. "She didn't just calculate outcomes, she felt them." Then his voice broke slightly. "They never listened to her." "Not really, not when it counted." He sat down on a nearby stool, one of the old ones, the kind with rusted bolts and a wobbly leg. "It was Professor Ellison who made the final call, wasn't it?" Elijah asked carefully. Clarence looked at him, his eyes tired but clear. "Yes, he was the lead. He approved the circuit, overrode our hesitation, and when it all went wrong," a long pause, "he blamed me." Silence filled the room. Clarence reached into his coat and pulled out a folded paper, the one Elijah had left on Ellison's desk. "He returned it," Clarence said, holding it up. "No note, just circled a line in Naomi's handwriting." The line read, "Clarence says entropy doesn't need control, just rhythm." "He remembered that?" Elijah asked. Clarence nodded, then added, "But he still won't speak my name." The bitterness in his tone wasn't sharp. It was quiet, resigned, like someone who had stopped expecting justice but never stopped grieving its absence. Later that afternoon, whispers began to spread through campus. A faculty assistant had seen Clarence walk into Lab 7. Word traveled fast. By dinner, students were posting about it. "The janitor's back in the Halos lab. They say he used to be one of the top minds here." There's a rumor he built the stabilizer that saved the system. And in a private conference room, 2 buildings over, Howard Ellison read every word of it. He closed his laptop, stared out the window. The sky was grey, heavy with late spring rain. Behind him, pinned to the wall, was a framed photograph from 1983. It showed the original Halos development team. Clarence was there. Young, brilliant, standing just behind Naomi Wells, who wore a smile that could disarm a room. And next to them, arms crossed, jaw tight, was Ellison himself. He pulled the frame down, opened the back. Inside, folded behind the picture, was a letter, sealed in 1983, never mailed. It was addressed to the University Ethics Board. He had written it the night after the accident, the first draft of what would become his defense. But this draft was never sent, because it contained the truth. Naomi had warned him. Clarence had begged for a delay. The circuit design had been rushed. Unstable. And Ellison? He had approved it anyway. Not out of malice, out of pressure, deadlines. Funding? Pride? He folded the letter shut again. Set it on the desk, then stared at it for a long time. Outside, the rain began to fall. Soft at first, then harder. He didn't cry. But for the first time in years, he felt the shape of guilt not as a punishment, but as a shadow, finally catching up. That evening, Elijah returned to the lounge where Clarence worked. The older man was seated at his usual table, carefully soldering something small and intricate. "You okay?" Elijah asked. Clarence looked up, blinked once. "Better than I thought I'd be," he said. "Worse than I hoped." Elijah sat across from him. "I think people are starting to believe," he said. Clarence didn't smile, but something in his eyes softened. "It's not about belief," he said. "It's about remembering." Then he turned back to the tiny circuit in his hands. And as the rain tapped against the windows, Elijah realized this wasn't the story of a forgotten janitor. It was the beginning of something deeper, something the university had buried. And now, piece by piece, it was rising again. By the time the morning sun reached the towers of Harvard, the whispers had turned into murmurs. In quiet corners of the library, in hushed tones between lectures, students began asking each other a question that hadn't been uttered in decades. Who exactly was Clarence Reed? Elijah Dawson was asking the same thing. After their visit to Lab 7, sleep had become a stranger. He found himself scrolling through old faculty rosters, poring over archived research papers, digging through anything he could find in the forgotten corners of the university's digital memory. But Clarence's name wasn't there, not in the official logs, not in the research citations. It was as if he had never existed. Elijah rubbed his eyes, exhausted, until he stumbled upon a single anomaly. A research grant application from 1983. It was scanned poorly, edges faded, but there it was, 3 initials, almost erased at the bottom. CWR Clarence Whitman Reed. His heart skipped. A few more clicks led him to a partially redacted internal memo from the same year, referencing a disciplinary hearing that had been quietly cancelled. Elijah leaned back in his chair, stunned. This wasn't just oversight. It was erasure. Intentional. That afternoon, he made his way across campus, stopping outside the office of Professor Howard Ellison. The door was shut. No surprise, he knocked. No answer. Still, Elijah slid a printed page under the door, the grant application with Clarence's name. He didn't expect a reply. But maybe, just maybe, it would unsettle something. Meanwhile, Clarence was polishing the same floor tiles he once walked as a student. He moved slowly, methodically. But his eyes, they watched the hallways differently now, as if the ghosts he'd long tried to ignore were walking beside him again. A group of undergrads passed him, laughing. One of them, a girl with curly hair and an overstuffed backpack, slowed down just enough to whisper, "I heard you saved Halos." Clarence didn't respond. He simply pushed his cart forward around the corner and vanished. But in that small moment, something changed. He had been seen, and it was no longer just Elijah who saw him. That night, Elijah found him in the staff lounge. Clarence was bent over a small device, copper wires coiled tightly into a lattice, bits of handwritten notes scattered across the table. "You never stopped building," Elijah said softly. Clarence didn't look up. His hands kept moving with the steadiness of ritual. "Why?" Elijah asked. "Why keep building if no one's watching?" Clarence finally paused. Then he said, without emotion or pride, "Because truth doesn't need an audience." Elijah sat across from him. "You're not just fixing machines," he said. "You're healing something that broke a long time ago." Clarence blinked. A beat of silence passed. Then he whispered, "I still hear her voice, you know, Naomi." Elijah's chest tightened. "I think she'd be proud," he said. Clarence gave a small shake of his head. "She wouldn't care about pride. She'd care about whether the question was answered." The next morning, Dr. Lorraine Adlerone of the newer deans in the School of Engineering stood staring at a schematic someone had anonymously left on her desk. It was labeled simply, "Thermal Rhythm Stabilizer. Read variant." The math was impossibly dense, elegant, not machine-generated. No timestamps, no AI footprints, just ink equations. Logic, and a strange beauty she hadn't seen in years. She took a breath and whispered to herself, "This isn't just function. This is care." And that was the word that began to spread quietly through the staff who had seen the schematics. Not brilliance, not innovation. Care. Meanwhile, back in the archives, Elijah made one final discovery. Tucked in the back of an old physics textbook, long forgotten on a shelf behind a filing cabinet, was a folded note. Handwritten, signed Naomi Wells. The ink had faded, but her words still burned. "Clarence, you were right. We shouldn't push the circuit tonight. Tell Ellison again if I can't. Love always, N." Elijah held the letter like something sacred. She had known. She had tried to stop it. And now, after all these years, her voice, like Clarence's, was speaking again. That evening, Elijah returned to the lounge. Clarence was there. Same stool, same quiet. Elijah didn't speak at first. He just placed the letter gently on the table. Clarence stared at it. His breath caught. His fingers trembled as they traced the curve of Naomi's handwriting, but he didn't cry. He just nodded. Softly. Then, after a long silence, he said, "She always said." A question asked at the right time can change everything. Elijah leaned forward. "And now?" Clarence looked him in the eye. "Now," someone finally asked. By Friday morning, word had spread farther than Elijah expected. The letter from Naomi Wells digitized and whispered about in quiet corners of the university, had shaken something loose. What had started as a spark between two people now flickered across faculty lounges, student networks, and even among custodial staff. But nowhere did the silence break louder than in the office of Dr. Howard Ellison. He sat alone, a mug of cold coffee beside him, staring at the same photograph he'd once pinned behind his desk drawer. It was old, black and white, 3 faces. Naomi's, his own, and Clarence's, captured in the early days of the Halos project, before everything fell apart. He used to look at that photo with pride. Now he couldn't look at it without flinching. In the stillness of that office, Howard reached into the bottom drawer. He hesitated, then pulled out a thin, confidential folder. The label read, "Read, Clarence Whitman, Internal Review, 1983. Inside were the memos, the damage control scripts, the original statement he'd submitted to the university board after Naomi's death. He skimmed it now, line by line. Procedural fault, unauthorized variance testing, recommendations for dismissal. All words crafted to protect his position, and all of them a lie. He whispered to no one, "I chose the wrong silence." Meanwhile, Elijah returned to the archives room. Not for more digging, but for clarity. He sat quietly, pages from Naomi's letter in one hand, his notebook in the other. He scribbled a question across the top of a fresh page. If they buried a man's name, how do we dig it back out? He didn't know the full answer, but he had an idea where to start. That afternoon, he printed the letter. He added a copy of Clarence's schematic. And then, with steady hands, he uploaded both to the internal student forum with a simple caption, "Harvard forgot someone. We shouldn't." By 6:01 p.m., the file had 300 views. By midnight, over 9,000. Someone spray-painted the steps outside the physics hall, "Reed built halos." In the lounge downstairs, Clarence sat beside his machine, unaware that his name was being whispered across campus. He was polishing copper wires, methodically as always. Elijah entered quietly, carrying a small tray with tea. "People know now," he said. Clarence didn't lift his head. "I didn't want them to," he murmured. "They needed to," Elijah replied. Clarence finally looked up. "I built that stabilizer to help Halos, not to make noise." "But maybe the noise is part of the healing," Elijah said gently. Clarence leaned back, exhausted. He looked older than Elijah had ever seen him, as if the weight of being remembered was heavier than being forgotten. Then, with a deep breath, Clarence asked, "What are they saying?" Elijah sat down across from him. "They're calling it the Reed variant. Some students are trying to rebuild it from your diagrams." Clarence raised an eyebrow. "And the faculty?" "Mostly quiet," Elijah said. "But not all. One professor said your math reads like rhythm. Another called it impossible and beautiful." Clarence gave a soft laugh. "I suppose beauty makes it harder to discredit." Later that night, a quiet knock sounded at the lounge door. Clarence looked up. Standing there, awkward and unsure, was a young student holding a schematic printout. "I'm sorry to bother you," she said, voice trembling. "I just wanted to ask, how did you get it to stabilize without a digital loop?" Clarence paused. Then he smiled. "Analog listens," he said. The student blinked. "What?" He leaned forward. "Digital control tells a system what to do. Analog hears what the system needs." The girl nodded slowly, trying to absorb it, and Clarence saw something familiar in her eyes. Curiosity, unpolished, unapologetic wonder, the kind he hadn't seen in decades. He handed her a piece of chalk. "Draw your version on the wall," he said. "Let's see what it says." By Saturday morning, the schematic had gone viral. A professor from MIT reached out privately. An alumnus from Caltech published a blog post titled "The Janitor Who Rewrote the Rules." And buried in the buzz, a message arrived for Elijah. From the office of Dean Lorraine Adler. It was brief. "We need to talk. Bring Mr. Reed if he's willing." Elijah showed it to Clarence. Clarence read it once, then set it down. "Tell her I'll come," he said. "But I'm not coming to defend anything." "What then?" Elijah asked. Clarence looked at the machine. "At some point, they have to see the truth themselves. I've already built it. Now they get to decide if they want to understand it." Elijah smiled. "And if they don't?" Clarence leaned back, hands folded. "Then we keep building. For the ones who will." The following Monday, Clarence Reed stepped into Hamilton Hall for the first time in decades, not as a janitor, but as someone the university had finally remembered. The same halls he once polished with silence now carried a different kind of echo, whispers of awe, curiosity, and for some, shame. Dean Lorraine Adler had arranged a closed-door meeting. Not a public forum, not yet, just a preliminary review between Clarence Elijah Dawson and 4 members of the university's Applied Sciences Committee. Clarence wore the same grey uniform as always, no badge, no tie. No pretense. When they invited him in, the air in the room grew still. Elijah stood beside him, notebook in hand, but said nothing. It was Clarence they had come to hear. Dean Adler leaned forward. "Mr. Reed, thank you for coming. I understand this is unusual." Clarence gave a small nod. "I suppose the truth always is." There was a pause. Then a younger professor, Dr. Rachel Monroe, spoke. "I've reviewed the thermal frequency schematic you posted and the system logs from Halos." She glanced down at her tablet. "Your stabilizer achieved equilibrium in under those O2 variants. That's unheard of." Clarence didn't flinch. "I didn't build it for the numbers." "Then why?" someone asked. He looked at the floor for a long moment, then said quietly, "To protect the system from itself." The room shifted, not because they understood yet, but because something about the way he said it made them want to. Dr. Monroe raised another question. "You used analog frequency mapping in a quantum simulation network. Why?" Clarence gave a half smile. "Because quantum logic isn't just about precision, it's about rhythm. About listening to the fluctuation rather than resisting it." He tapped his chest. "The heartbeat of a system doesn't need to be controlled, it needs to be heard." Someone muttered under their breath, "That's philosophy, not physics." Clarence turned to the voice, calm but steady. "Then maybe physics forgot how to listen?" No one replied. Dean Adler cleared her throat. "There's growing attention around your work, Mr. Reed. Some faculty want to present it to the Halos board. Others are more cautious." Clarence shrugged. "I didn't come to be presented. I came because a student asked why." Her gaze shifted to Elijah. "Mr. Dawson, you've worked directly with Mr. Reed. What's your assessment?" Elijah finally spoke. "He didn't just fix Halos. He showed us that the way we approach problems with noise, with urgency, with pride, might be why they break in the first place." He held up his notebook. "I don't understand all of his equations. Not yet, but I understand the spirit behind them." A long silence followed. Then Dean Adler asked the question they'd all been circling. "Mr. Reed, would you consider sharing your design in a formal academic setting?" Clarence didn't answer right away. He studied the chalkboard on the far wall. Blank, but full of potential. "I'm not interested in applause," he said. "Or credits, or conferences." He looked directly at the dean. "But if you give me a room, a board, and students who ask real questions, I'll show them how to listen." By that evening, word had spread again. A small, unused seminar room beneath the east wing of the science building was quietly reassigned. It had no sign on the door, just a handwritten note taped beside it, "The Listening Lab." The first night, 5 students showed up. Elijah was one of them. So was Rachel Monroe, and a senior named Jamie, who had nearly failed out of the quantum mechanics course last semester. Clarence entered without fanfare, wore the same grey uniform, carried no slides. Just a folded napkin in one hand. He walked to the board, unfolded the napkin, picked up a piece of chalk, and wrote a single question. What happens when a system stops resisting its own instability? He turned. "Not rhetorical," he said. "Answer it. Wrong answers encouraged, because that's where the gold is." The students looked at each other, unsure. Then slowly, Jamie raised her hand. "I think maybe it finds balance, not by forcing it, but by learning to live with it." Clarence smiled and nodded. "Exactly." By Friday, the room was full, and no one asked for extra credit. They just wanted to be in the room. Because Clarence Reed didn't teach like a man with a degree, he taught like someone who had spent his life listening. And finally, someone was listening to him. By the second week, the whispers had turned into quiet ripples across campus. Students from outside the physics department began stopping by the listening lab. Not just to learn, but to witness. Witness something they didn't quite have words for yet. There were no grades, no handouts, no attendance taken. Only a man in a grey uniform who asked questions that made them pause and think. Clarence Reed had never taught in the traditional sense. He didn't pace the room or recite definitions from textbooks. He sat, he listened, and when he spoke, it was always a question wrapped in quiet fire. Why do you think entropy feels like grief? What if resistance is just fear with a formula? Some laughed nervously, most leaned forward. They had never been taught physics like this, never been asked to feel their way through the math. Clarence didn't care about elegant proofs or complex algorithms. He cared about rhythm, the pulse behind the principle. And slowly, something strange began to happen. Students started staying after hours. Not just physics majors, art students, history majors. Even a janitor from the music building asked if he could just sit in the back and listen. Clarence nodded once. That was enough. Elijah Dawson, meanwhile, had become something of an unofficial apprentice. He still attended his regular classes, still submitted assignments. But his heart lived in the listening lab. Every evening, he'd arrive early and stay late, scribbling diagrams into his worn notebook, trying to trace the shape of ideas Clarence dropped like breadcrumbs. He wasn't the only one. Dr. Rachel Monroe, the same professor who had once questioned Clarence's methods, now visited the lab regularly. She didn't speak much, but she always took notes. One evening, after the session ended and the others had left, she approached Clarence at the board. "You know," she said softly, "I've spent 15 years chasing theoretical balance through chaotic systems. Clarence didn't look up. "But what you built," she continued, "it doesn't chase, it listens." He nodded slowly. "Because chasing noise only leads to more noise." She smiled faintly. "And listening?" He finally looked at her. "Listening reveals what the noise was hiding." That same week, the Internal Physics Research Forum lit up. Someone had anonymously uploaded part of the stabilizer schematic. No explanation, no name attached, just the design. The discussion exploded. Professors across the country started chiming in, trying to decipher its construction. Some dismissed it as a hoax. Others recognized patterns that hadn't appeared in peer-reviewed work yet. Dr. Howard Ellison, still clinging to his authority as Chair of Applied Sciences, issued a statement. Unauthorized devices should not be glorified. Harvard remains committed to verified science. But even he couldn't stop the momentum, because something had shifted, and not just in the lab. In the culture, in the questions being asked between lectures, in hallway conversations, in the way students now paused before assuming an answer. Clarence Reed had never asked for a platform. But he had one now, and Elijah knew they had to protect it. One rainy Friday afternoon, he approached Dean Adler's office. She was reviewing departmental budgets when he knocked. "Dean Adler," he said, "may I suggest something?" She raised an eyebrow. "Go on." "A formal symposium," he said. "Not for faculty, for students, open forum. Let Clarence present the stabilizer to undergraduates. Let them ask questions. Let the conversation begin at their level." She studied him. "You realize the politics involved, don't you?" He nodded. "But Clarence isn't interested in politics." She looked out the window at the gray sky hanging over Harvard Yard. Then she smiled. "Fine, but don't call it a symposium." Elijah tilted his head. "What should we call it?" She leaned back in her chair. "Call it what it is, a quiet reckoning." The following Thursday, flyers appeared around campus. No logos, no faculty sponsors. Just 3 lines in plain black text. Thursday, room 103. Listening Lab. Presents a quiet reckoning, open to all. When Clarence saw the flyer, he didn't say a word. Just nodded once, folded it, and slipped it into his pocket. That night, he sat by the window in the lounge, polishing the stabilizer with a cloth like he always did. Elijah sat across from him, nervous. "You ready?" he asked. Clarence didn't answer right away. Then he looked up and said, "I don't think the world needs more answers, Elijah. I think it needs better questions." Elijah smiled. "That's what you've been giving us." Clarence shook his head gently. "No. That's what you've been brave enough to ask." He reached across the table and placed the folded flyer in Elijah's notebook. "This next part," he said, voice soft, "belongs to you." The evening of the event arrived quietly, without fanfare or announcement. No press, no dignitaries. Just students. They filled room 103 in waves, folding chairs scraping across the floor, notebooks tucked under arms, eyes wide with something between curiosity and reverence. At the front of the room sat a simple table. On it rested the stabilizer, still wrapped in its worn cloth, like something sacred. Clarence Reed stood beside it, not in a suit or behind a podium, but in his familiar grey work uniform. He didn't carry a laptop, just a small piece of chalk in his breast pocket. He didn't clear his throat. He didn't adjust his posture. He simply looked out at the crowd and said, "I was never supposed to be here." A quiet hush fell over the room. "I used to clean this floor when the lights were off." I knew every creak in these boards, every corner where dust gathered. I thought that's all I'd ever know of Harvard again. Elijah Dawson stood off to the side, watching closely, his notebook clutched tight. Clarence continued. But sometimes the things we build in the dark end up shining brightest in the light. He carefully unwrapped the stabilizer and placed it on the table. The students leaned forward, almost as if they were afraid to breathe too loud. This device, he said, doesn't just stabilize heat variance. It listens. It synchronizes. He paused, tapping gently on the metal casing. It doesn't force systems into order. It lets them find their own rhythm. A student in the front row raised her hand. Why does that matter? Clarence looked at her with a soft smile. Because the world has enough machines that impose control. What we need are devices that allow systems people to find harmony. Another hand went up. How did you come up with it? I mean, you're not on faculty. He tilted his head. I was, once. The room shifted slightly. You could feel the students lean into the moment. I built this not in a lab with a team, but in a closet with quiet. I used copper coils from discarded monitors, repurposed timing capacitors from old microwaves. I didn't have funding. I had memory and grief. He ran a hand slowly over the top of the device. This was never meant to be seen. Elijah stepped forward now, holding a yellowed document. This is a copy of the original schematic. Clarence didn't release this. I did. Because I knew what it was, and I knew what it meant. He turned to the students. You've heard the rumors. About how Halos failed, how it came back online the next morning like a ghost had whispered to it. He pointed to the stabilizer. This is what whispered. Gasps fluttered through the room. Clarence remained still. I didn't come here to be applauded, he said quietly. I came here to tell you something important. He stepped away from the table and wrote on the chalkboard behind him. What happens when we stop listening? He turned back to the class. That's the question Harvard didn't ask for 40 years. And what happened? A student asked. Clarence looked out at the rows of young faces. They forgot the sound of truth. The room went silent. Outside, spring rain began tapping against the windows. It was the kind of quiet that felt holy. Clarence picked up the stabilizer and turned it slightly, revealing a tiny engraving near the base. 3 initials, carved by hand. N.W. A girl near the back recognized it first. Naomi Wells, she whispered. Clarence nodded once. She helped build the theory this was based on. She warned us before the accident. Her voice was ignored. And it cost her everything. Another student raised a hand. Is that why you kept working? All these years? Clarence looked down, then nodded slowly. Because silence didn't save her, and it won't save us. One more hand. A young man with ink-stained fingers. What should we do with this knowledge? Clarence didn't answer right away. Then he looked up. You honor it by listening better. You build systems that don't erase people. You question the questions you're asked, and when you find something that works not because it dominates, but because it resonates, you protect it. He stepped back, folded the cloth over the stabilizer once more. And then, he said gently, you teach someone else. No applause followed, just silence. The right kind. The kind that sinks in. When the room emptied out, Elijah stayed behind. He walked over to Clarence, voice low. They heard you. Clarence didn't reply. He just sat down, exhausted, but peaceful. And somewhere deep in the Harvard network, the first student forum post appeared under the tag, "Resonance, not resistance." It simply read, "He taught us how to hear again." The days that followed the symposium were different. Not in any obvious way, no grand announcements, no breaking news headlines, but in the way students spoke to each other in the halls, in how professors paused before dismissing a question too quickly, in how chalkboards stayed smudged a little longer. Something had shifted. The name Clarence Reed was no longer spoken in whispers or confined to the custodial schedule. It had begun to echo in places it once never reached. Seminar rooms, think tanks, even the internal review board. Not because he demanded it, but because people, especially the students, could no longer look away. One afternoon, Elijah Dawson received an email. The subject line was simple. Board recommendation, project redesign. Attached was a memo from the Academic Council recommending that the Halos project be restructured under a new directive, the Reed-Wells Quantum Initiative. Noah blinked in disbelief. He printed the memo, walked straight to the basement lounge, and found Clarence where he always was, cleaning copper terminals on the stabilizer like they were relics from a cathedral. Clarence looked up only briefly as Elijah entered, then returned to his work. "They renamed the project," Elijah said quietly. "After you and Naomi." Clarence didn't stop polishing. "I didn't ask for that." "I know. But they did it anyway." Clarence wiped his hands and took the paper. He read it slowly, eyes tracing every line with the same patience he gave circuits. When he finished, he folded it once and placed it under his teacup. "You think that changes things?" he asked softly. Elijah hesitated. "I think it means they finally know who really built it." Clarence shook his head. "No. What it means is that they finally remembered who they ignored." Pause. "There's a difference." Later that week, the new nameplate was quietly installed at the entrance of the Halos research wing. It read, "The Reed-Wells Quantum Initiative," a tribute to silent brilliance and voices once unheard. There was no ribbon-cutting ceremony, just a small gathering of students and faculty standing in the spring sunlight, watching as the final bolt was tightened into the wall. Elijah stood near the back, hands in his pockets. He looked for Clarence, but he was nowhere in sight. Instead, he was in room 103, the listening lab, wiping the chalkboard clean, setting out fresh napkins on the desks and straightening chairs that had already been straightened. Because that's what he did. He prepared the space for others to speak. That evening, the room filled again. This time, something was different. Clarence didn't bring the stabilizer. Instead, he brought a small wooden box. No one asked what was inside. He placed it on the windowsill, then wrote a sentence on the board. "What do we owe to the ones we forgot?" Silence. Then a student raised her hand. "Do you mean forgotten people? Or forgotten ideas?" Clarence turned, chalk still in hand. "Both." Another student asked, "Can forgetting be repaired?" Clarence paused. "Not always, but it can be remembered differently." They talked for nearly 2 hours that night, not about equations or hardware, but about legacy and who gets to write it. And near the end of the session, a student asked a question that quieted the room. "Will you keep teaching here?" Clarence looked around at the half-circle of eager faces. He took a breath, then said, "No." The disappointment was immediate. One student actually gasped. Clarence smiled gently. "This room doesn't need me." Not anymore. He looked at Elijah. It has him. Elijah's throat tightened. He hadn't expected that. He hadn't even wanted it until now. Clarence continued, I built in silence for 40 years. Not because I was noble, but because I didn't know how to speak again. Pause. You taught me that I could. That night, after the students left, Clarence and Elijah sat side by the window, watching the campus lights flicker on one by one. I'm leaving, Clarence said. Elijah turned to him. For good? Clarence nodded. I think it's time. Elijah didn't argue. He just asked, Where will you go? Clarence looked up at the night sky. Someplace quiet. Someplace with trees and maybe a whiteboard. Then he reached into the wooden box on the windowsill and handed Elijah something wrapped in cloth. It was the stabilizer. Elijah held it like a relic, like history. Why are you giving this to me? Because it doesn't belong in a vault, Clarence said. It belongs in hands that still ask why. Elijah looked down at the machine, then back at the man who built it. And in that moment, without needing to say it, he knew Clarence wasn't disappearing. He was finally becoming. The weeks after Clarence's quiet departure moved like pages fluttering in the wind. Harvard kept going, lectures resumed, research deadlines loomed, and the Reed-Wells Quantum Initiative made its way into official grant proposals and white papers. But for Elijah Dawson, the world felt strangely hollow. Every evening he found himself returning to room 103. Not because he had to, but because Clarence had. He'd sweep the floors, erase the chalkboard with care, arrange the chairs just like Clarence used to, and sit in silence, listening to the echoes left behind. On a rainy Thursday, Elijah opened the small notebook Clarence had once handed him. Tucked in the back pocket was a folded napkin, Clarence's handwriting unmistakable. The words read, Don't teach to be heard. Teach so they remember how to listen. It hit him like a slow thunder. That night, Elijah stayed late after the last seminar. Only 2 students remained. They asked about the stabilizer again, how it worked, why no one had built one like it before. Elijah smiled. Because they weren't trying to listen to the silence, he said. The stabilizer now sat behind glass at the university's science museum. Visitors walked by, reading the small plaque, some snapping photos. But Elijah knew it didn't belong in a display case. It wasn't an artifact. It was a question, and questions don't belong behind glass. One afternoon, Elijah visited the office of Dr. Howard Ellison, still technically the senior advisor on Halos, though increasingly absent. The man was older now, gaunter. Time had pulled at his posture, and something behind his eyes seemed sunken. Elijah placed a copy of the internal memo on his desk, the one that renamed the project after Clarence and Naomi. You've read it, I assume, Elijah said. Ellison looked up, guarded. I've seen it. Elijah's tone remained calm. Why didn't you speak up back then, when they erased him? When they blamed him? Ellison sighed and leaned back. Because I was afraid, he said flatly. Afraid of losing my position. Afraid of being tied to failure. Harvard doesn't reward the truth. It rewards the survivor. Elijah didn't respond at first. He just looked at the man for a long time. He never wanted revenge, Elijah said softly, only to be remembered. Ellison turned his gaze to the window. He got that much. No, Elijah corrected. He earned that much. When Elijah left, he walked the long way back to the lab, past the engineering wing, past the quad where spring flowers now bloomed. He thought of Naomi Welsoff, the letter she had written, the warning she tried to give that no one read in time. He stopped beneath the plaque outside the physics center. Her name was etched in bronze now, next to Clarence's. But still, he thought, it wasn't enough. That night, Elijah hosted the largest gathering the listening lab had ever seen. 30 students, 2 professors, 1 janitor from the math building who brought cookies. The room hummed with quiet anticipation. On the board, Elijah wrote a single sentence. What would you build if no one ever gave you credit? It was the kind of question Clarence would have asked. One student raised a hand. A better city, she said. Another added, a quieter classroom. One whispered, a machine that helps people breathe better. Elijah didn't interrupt. He simply listened just as Clarence had taught him. Then a girl in the back, a transfer student who hadn't spoken all term, raised her hand. She asked, what did Clarence build, really? I mean, beyond the stabilizer? Elijah thought for a long moment before answering. He built space, he said. Space for all of us to find our questions again. Space for the forgotten to remember themselves. And with that, the room fell silent, not awkward, not empty. Full. Afterward, Elijah remained alone in the lab, the chalkboard still covered with dreams. He flipped through Clarence's notebook again. Near the middle, he found a note scrawled in the margin. Build with humility. Teach with silence. Lead with questions. Suddenly, it made sense. Clarence hadn't been trying to create a legacy, he had been trying to give one away. The next day, Elijah mailed a package. No return address. Inside, a copy of the notebook, a photograph of Naomi Wells, and a short note that simply read, "This is what you tried to bury. She still speaks." He addressed it to the Board of Trustees. Noah signed nothing, but he knew they'd read it, and maybe, just maybe this time, they'd finally learn how to listen. The hearing that followed was never broadcast. There were no reporters at the door, no streaming links, no photographers in the hallway, but words still got out. Whispers at first, then recountings from those who were there, because moments like that don't stay locked behind walls for long. It was raining that morning again. A cold, steady drizzle settled over Harvard Yard, soaking the walkways and softening the air. In the chamber of University Hall, the mood matched the weather. Heavy, quiet. Expectant. Clarence Reed arrived early. He wore the same thing he always did, grey work pants, worn boots, a faded jacket. No tie, no notes, no name tag. Just a folded letter in his back pocket, and his silence. The same silence he had worn for 40 years. Across the room, seated alone, was Dr. Howard Ellison. The man who had once spoken to the press with such certainty. The man who had signed off on the memo that removed Clarence from history. He didn't speak when Clarence entered. He didn't look at him either. The board was small. 6 faculty members, all with long titles and longer tenures. At the center sat Dean Reynolds, posture stiff, jaw set. He cleared his throat and began the proceedings. We are here to re-examine the events of May 3rd, 1983, he said. Specifically, the lab accident that took the life of Naomi Wells and the academic actions that followed involving Mr. Clarence Reed. He paused, looked at Ellison. You may speak in your defense. For a moment, no one moved. Then Ellison stood. He didn't pull out a statement, didn't reference notes. He just stood there, alone, and let the weight of the past settle into the room. "I was afraid," he began. "That's the only honest way to say it." He turned toward Clarence, voice quieter now. "I blamed you because I needed a way out, because I couldn't face the truth that Naomi had warned us, that she trusted you more than me, that you saw something I didn't. And when the worst happened, I buried the evidence. I silenced the warning. I erased your name from the work we built together." He took a breath. "I don't deserve forgiveness, and I don't expect it. But I want it known. I knew what I did, and I knew what I cost you." Silence filled the chamber like a tide. Dean Reynolds nodded, then turned to Clarence. "Mr. Reed, would you like to respond?" Clarence didn't stand. He didn't raise his voice. But when he spoke, the room leaned in. "You took more than my name," he said gently. "You took time. Years I could have spent teaching, building, helping students like Elijah find their questions. But I forgave you a long time ago." Ellison blinked. Several on the board shifted in their chairs. "I didn't forgive you for you," Clarence continued. "I did it for me, because if I hadn't, I would have drowned in the silence. And I still had things to build." Dean Reynolds sat straighter. "The university is prepared to issue a formal censure against Dr. Ellison," he announced. "We can strip tenure, retract published work, revoke awards." Clarence raised a hand. "No." Reynolds looked confused. "No?" Clarence stood now. Slowly, calmly. "Let him keep the plaques and the papers. Let the awards sit on his shelf, but make him do one thing." He looked at Ellison. "Sit in the back of my next class and listen." It was the only punishment that mattered. Ellison said nothing, just nodded once, his shoulders falling, not in defeat, but in release. The hearing adjourned, no expulsion, no press release. But something greater happened that day. A man who had buried a name was asked to remember, and a man who had been forgotten chose to teach, not to condemn. That Friday, the listening lab filled to capacity. Students packed the benches. Former skeptics stood along the back wall. Even a few faculty members came not to supervise but to sit. Clarence entered quietly, chalk in hand. He wrote a single question on the board. "What does it mean to be wrong with integrity?" Then he looked at the back row and nodded. Dr. Ellison entered, no notes, no lecture, just presence. He sat down and listened. That night, as the students debated and explored, Elijah leaned over and whispered to Clarence, "Why didn't you let them punish him?" Clarence didn't look up. He just smiled faintly. "Because when you tear a man down, all you feed is shame. But when you ask him to listen, sometimes, for the first time, he hears himself. And in that silence, something shifted again. Not a storm. Not a speech. Just a room full of minds that had learned how to ask better questions. Clarence Reed never announced he was leaving. There was no farewell note, no ceremony, no final lecture. One morning, he simply didn't show up. The hallway outside the listening lab was quiet, as it always was at that hour, but something felt missing. The janitor cart was gone. The air didn't carry the scent of chalk dust and coffee the way it usually did. By mid-afternoon, whispers began. Maybe he was sick. Maybe he took a break. But Elijah Dawson knew better. He walked the campus, retracing the steps he and Clarence had taken so many times before, past the science wing, through the back of the archives, up the quiet stairwell no one else used. Nothing. No sign of him. Not even a note, until he checked the bottom drawer. Behind the whiteboard in the listening lab, tucked in a cabinet that hadn't been opened in years, Elijah found it. A single torn scrap of paper taped inside. It was from a maintenance log, the kind Clarence had scribbled on for decades. The handwriting was unmistakable, sharp, quiet, steady. "Everything I've never said is here." Beneath it was a leather-bound notebook, old and worn, its edges frayed like a well-read Bible. Elijah held his breath and opened it. Inside were pages upon pages of diagrams. Some were familiar circuit sketches, mathematical models, thermodynamic theories, but most were unfiltered, raw thoughts. Concepts that didn't have answers yet, scribbled phrases in the margins like, "What if entropy is only misunderstood rhythm? Test equation against silence, not noise. Try again with smaller compassion, not larger voltage." In between, the math were quotes. Some from Clarence, many from Naomi Wells, snippets she had once said in passing, now preserved like scripture. Don't solve to impress. Solve to understand. Ask the kindest version of your question first, and in the back of the notebook, drawings, not technical ones, gentle ones. A teacup, a student's shoes tucked beneath a chair, the campus river at dusk. A chalkboard covered in half-finished thoughts, each one quiet, each one tender. And on the very last page, written not in ink, but gently etched in pencil, barely visible, "When the world silences someone, listen harder. When they forget the name, become the echo. When they leave, teach." Elijah closed the book, hands trembling. Not out of grief, but out of something deeper, gratitude. Harvard changed in the months that followed, not in loud ways, not through sweeping policy or shiny banners, but in whispers, in how students spoke to one another, how questions were asked in the dark, how curiosity began to feel less like performance and more like permission. The listening lab remained. A new plaque was placed at the door. "The Whitaker Room for all who stayed after hours." And behind the desk stood Elijah. Older now. More grounded, he didn't always teach. Sometimes he just sat. Sometimes he just asked one question and let the room carry the rest. One night, during a rainstorm, he looked up from his notes to find an unfamiliar face at the door, a man from the maintenance staff at the music building. "Mind if I sit in?" the man asked. Elijah smiled. Always room for another voice. That evening, he wrote a question on the board. What does it mean to know something? And underneath it, is knowing, remembering, or recognizing? The students leaned in. Some wrote notes. Others just listened. And when Elijah asked, "What did Clarence teach us?" the answers came, not rushed, not loud, just honest. He taught us that answers aren't weapons, that learning doesn't have to be loud, that genius isn't rare, it's just rarely heard. And Elijah nodded. Exactly. Now let's build something with that. Far from campus, in a quiet town with more trees than traffic lights, a man sat on a porch, sipping tea as the sun set behind the hills. Clarence Reed. His hair had gone fully white. His hands were slower but steady. No phone. No laptop, just a workbench, a piece of chalk. And a new notebook still empty, still waiting. He opened the cover, picked up his pencil, and began again. not to be remembered, not to prove a point. But because somewhere, someone was still asking why, and that was always enough. Clarence Reed's story reminds us that true brilliance doesn't always wear a title or stand at a podium. Sometimes it pushes a cart at 2 a.m. through empty halls, building quietly in the shadows what the world fails to see. The lesson is not just about injustice, but about resilience. When society forgets your name, you can still leave a legacy that whispers through generations. For older Americans, many of whom have been sidelined, underestimated, or quietly stepped back, this story speaks deeply. It says, "You are not done mattering." The value of a life isn't measured in applause, but in the questions we help others ask. Clarence chose not bitterness, but rebuilding, not revenge, but teaching. In a world obsessed with being loud and right, perhaps the most powerful act is to listen, to guide, and to pass on the spark that once lit your own path. The world may forget, but truth remembers, and when it does, it remembers those who built quietly, cared deeply, and never stopped asking, why?